Okay.
Justin,
Thanks very much, Tamiris.
Slides.
So maybe I'll just start by welcoming our three next speakers in this new session on environmental economic accounting, the last in the 2 days on the well-being and sustainability work under the SNA revision. So we have, again, three very interesting topics. The first will be presenting work by Jim Tabrake and Emmanuel Manolakakis at the International Monetary Fund. And this dives into the complexities of how to in the national account space. Extremely important topic. Aims dominance when to mitigate climate change. Second presentation will be work commissioned by the World Bank, and the presentation will be by Gregors Pesco from the World Bank and Rob Smith from Midsummer Analytics. And it will be really talking about accounting for renewable energy. This is some groundbreaking work that will be introduced to the World Bank's Changing Wealth of Nations release. So we look forward to hearing about that. And then the third will be a very interesting presentation on policy use in the Netherlands by Roel de la Haye. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Roel. Please feel free to correct me. That really demonstrates how the integration of SNA and SEYA information can yield some meaningful information that applies to particular policy applications in the Netherlands, but they're very generally applicable everywhere. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to my former partner in crime, as I like to say, Emmanuel Manolakakis, who I worked very closely with at Statistics Canada. So Emmanuel, take us through, and I would say hold your seat on this one because it really dives into a lot of really meaty stuff around the tricky parts of the treatment of this particular phenomenon in SNA. So Emmanuel, please. Great.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So welcome, everyone. My name is Emmanuel Manolakakis, and I'll be presenting this mission note that James Tabrake and myself have put together. Just as a background, so this is as part of the task team on well-being and sustainability and the sub-area group environmental economic accounting. Okay, I'm just going to turn off my camera so I can concentrate a little bit better on the presentation. Next slide, please. Right, so a little bit of an overview. So economic activity is having an increasing negative impact on the environment, and to slow the increase of this negative externality and eliminate greenhouse gases altogether, countries around the world have introduced or are planning to introduce measures aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Two of the more popular instruments to date are carbon taxes and emission trading schemes, cap and trade. It's important that the associated transactions, across all sectors are properly accounted for and transparently presented in the system of national accounts, and are harmonized and consistent with, the GFS, the BOP, and the SEYA. Next slide, please. Now, the following chart shows the prevalence of emission trading schemes or cap and trade schemes and carbon taxes, which have been either implemented or scheduled for implementation. And as of 2019, these measures covered approximately 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions, as tabulated by the World Bank. Next slide, please. While these schemes, are not very significant, we know that over the next number of years, there will be an increasingly large focus on climate change mitigation, and perhaps other countries who currently have not enacted any initiatives may decide to do so. As such, it is important to ensure that the current treatment is still relevant. Next slide, please. And again, thank you. So some of the salient features of emission trading schemes are: an ETS is a flexible market mechanism and establishes a maximum level of pollution, a cap. Companies are required to cover each unit of CO2 they produce with an emission permit. The government establishes a limit that is applied to the emission permit for a specific period and quantity, a quota. Initially, permits were provided freely, to CO2 polluting entities. Thereafter, permits are issued through the primary market through an auction process, which is open to all. Next slide, please. And the treatment and recording, the current treatment in the 2000 SNA, and a little bit of a background. So currently, in the 2008 SNA, emission permits are considered as other taxes on production, where the tax revenue, sale of the emission permit, is valued at the time of surrender. From the outset, it was recognized that the proposed treatment did not fully reflect all the dimensions of emission permits. And therefore, a task force was established which reviewed how emission permits could be recorded. The task force considered and provided detailed examples of various options. And following the considerations of the task force, and given that the atmosphere was not considered as an asset, the Intersecretariat Working Group on National Accounts, SEYA, chose the split asset approach as the recommended treatment for emission permits. Next slide, please. All right. So with this approach, the sale of emission permits will be considered as a financial asset, account receivable, prepaid tax by the acquirer, with a corresponding financial liability for the government, and accounts payable. Upon surrender, the government would record revenue, other taxes, at the original issue price. The tax accrual will be recorded when the emissions occurred. If at any point in time the market price of the emission permits differs from the original issue price, that difference would be reflected as a non-produced, non-financial asset, hence the split asset. Now, general government debt will not be affected by changes in the market value of permits. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, there are several practical challenges that countries have experienced when implementing the split asset approach. One of them is the classification of a prepaid tax consistent with permit holders other than CO2 emitting entities? And another difficulty is how to deal with cross-border trading of permits and the resultant discrepancy between government revenue from auctions and the subsequent surrender of permits. And what should be the economic value of emission permits at the time the permits are issued, or their market value at the time of surrender? Thank you. Before presenting alternate options for recording emission permits, it is important to recall certain concepts in the 2008 SNA and examine their applicability to emission permits. So we know that taxes are compulsory, unrequited payments. However, an argument can be made that emission permits acquired by other than CO2 emitting entities are not compulsory and are in fact requited. That is, they are acquiring a tradable asset as an investment or for humanitarian reasons. Next slide, please. Now, in economies where a mature, fully developed market of emission permits exists, there are initiatives where corporations may purchase emission permits from one jurisdiction and continue to operate from their home jurisdiction, and then surrender the permits to another area. These cross-border transactions may result in situations where a government will be receiving tax revenue from production activities that occurred in another country. Now, the split asset approach cannot accommodate the complexities and interpretability of these international schemes. Next slide, please. Now, if we would consider emission permits as some form of asset as opposed to payment of taxes, some of these issues can be overcome. However, as was mentioned, according to the manual, these permits do not involve the use of a natural asset. The atmosphere is not owned or controlled by an economic unit and therefore is not part of the asset boundary. Okay. So what we're proposing is the creation of an asset that reflects the right to use climate regulating services of the atmosphere, okay, for specific production activities. So by governments issuing permits, it implies or suggests that they are exercising some kind of ownership rights over the atmosphere and are trying to regulate its use. The right to use asset, as embodied in the emission permit, provides a benefit to the economic owner, either in terms of being able to continue to operate or as a potential investment. And permits are tradable and satisfy the criteria of assets. However, what type of assets are they? Next slide, please. Emission permits differ from some other types of permits issued by government, such as casino or taxi permits. These permits, casino and taxi permits, are issued to limit the supply and in effect provide monopoly profits to the owners of those permits. Conversely, the primary purpose of emission permits is not to limit the supply of goods and services, nor provide monopoly profits. In addition, emission permits do not cleanly fit in the category of other natural resources, which currently includes the radio spectra. One of the key differences between emission permits and fishing and other quotas is that for the latter, a natural resource is being used by an institutional unit to derive an economic benefit. Whereas in the case of emission permits, the natural resource is being degraded by the activities being undertaken to provide economic benefits. Next slide, please. So given these differences, one way to include the right of use assets is to broaden the coverage and the definition of our current classification of contracts, licenses, and permits to include right of use natural assets. Okay. The recording will be relatively simple and straightforward. There will be an appearance of an asset through a volume change, which is subsequently sold by the government and eventually disappears. And in this recommendation, general government net lending and borrowing will be impacted by the appearance of and the disappearance of the asset. However, the net worth will not. Next slide, please. Now, the previous recommendation, the right of use asset, has certain shortcomings, okay, that need to be taken into account. Okay, so a third option that we would like to propose is, looking at emission permits as a resource rent. Again, one can argue that the atmosphere is an economic asset and is similar to the treatment of fishing quotas, timber, and mineral resources. And one of the many services that the atmosphere provides is a mechanism to capture and store emissions, which could be valued by the sale of permits. Under this scenario, one may consider the issue of permits as a prepaid resource rent, where the payment grants the acquirer with the right to emit a pre-specified quantity of CO2 sometime in the future. And in order to bridge the timing difference between the issue price and the market price, we could also introduce a forward. Next slide, please. So similar to the split asset approach, the resource rent is going to have two components. There's going to be a financial asset, account receivable and payable, similar to the split asset approach, and then there'll be a simultaneous creation of a forward with a zero value. And again, in this scenario here, there will be some variability in general government net lending borrowing, which may arise from the market price. However, general government debt will not be affected by the change in value of permits. Next slide, please. So, ways forward. There's three ways that we could pursue and record emission permits in the system national accounts. We could continue with the split asset approach that was endorsed by the SEYA, but perhaps we might want to modify it, to take into account some of the anomalies. Okay, so for instance, if the market price is lower than the issue price, we might have a negative asset with the split asset approach. So we might want to sort of like put a limit and say, no, it can't go beyond negative, etc. We could go with the second option and recognize that the atmosphere as an asset that reflects the right to use the climate regulating services of the atmosphere as part of a specific production activities. And we'll have a new category to include rights of use of assets. Or we can extend the asset boundary to include the atmosphere in tree permits as a resource lease, the rent approach. Thank you. Now,
Emmanuel, I just want to let you know you have about 2.5 minutes left.
Okay, sorry, this is my last slide, so it was great. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so regardless of which approach that will be accepted, we need to test the proposed recommendation to ensure consistency across countries and ensure that the data will be available for national statistical compilers. Okay, and that the recommendation will be accepted internationally. Okay, and will be consistent with the other manuals of the system national accounts, being the balance of payments, the GFS, and of course the SEYA. And that concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. It's very impressive that you were able to be so clear and succinct with all of these complex treatments and lay them out very, very explicitly. This really sort of highlights the complexities around the current treatment of emissions permits. And of course, this is an issue that's not going to go away. And includes a lot of really fascinating challenges for national accounts compilers and across all of the related statistical standards. So I think it's really important that we address this in the right way and dig into all these meaty issues. So with that, we'll come back at the end, but we're going to move on to the next presentation, which is renewable energy assets, accounting for renewable energy assets. And I believe it's Rob Smith who's going to lead off by Rob and Greg Hortz about work that's going on at the World Bank. So Rob, please take it away. And you have 15 minutes once you get going. So are you going, Rob, you'll be sharing your screen?
I will be as soon as I can figure out how to make that work.
Great.
In fact, all right. And it doesn't seem to be working.
So did you try the icon on top there, the sharing, and then you hit Windows and then it should go to. If you're unable to get it up, I think the organizers can post the version that you sent in.
Okay,
and change the slides for you and Greg Hortz. Oh, something seems to be happening.
It's actually me, Marlon Jigitekov.
Oh, it's you?
Yeah. So I don't know if.
So Rob, I guess Marlon will for you, and you can just let him know when you need to change.
Yeah, it's not working. I'm sorry. It's something to do with Chrome sharing of something or other. So anyway, okay. So if we can go to the first slide then, please. Right. So thanks, Catherine, very much for the invitation to participate. So our presentation, Jegers and my presentation, is going to parallel very much what we just heard from Emmanuel. So that's quite interesting. So what we're talking about today is a very similar issue, which is the treatment of renewable energy as an asset in the context of the national accounts. So this is work that emerges from work that has been going on at the World Bank for many years under the title of Where is the Wealth of Nations, or Measuring the Changing Wealth of Nations. And that's all about measuring wealth comprehensively. So not just focusing on produced and natural or produced and financial capital, but also measuring natural social and human capital as well. Until now, in the efforts that the World Bank has undertaken in this area, renewable energy has not been included. So to the extent that energy has been included, it has been only in the form of fossil fuel assets. And that seemed to be a considerable gap because, as everyone knows, renewable energy is increasingly important in the economy. And in fact, our view is that it has become too important to emit from national balance sheets. So we really need to address this question of how to treat renewable energy as an asset and how to ensure that it is included on the balance sheets of nature. So the intention of the World Bank is to begin to produce estimates of the value of renewable energy assets that will be included in the next issue of the Changing Wealth of Nations. So the bank is really trying to get out in front here and show by way of action that it is important to put values on these things. So next slide, please. So at the moment, the system of national accounts does not address renewable energy assets at all. It implies that they're not assets because ownership rights can't be enforced over them. But the SNA, frankly, has very little to say about renewable energy assets at all. It simply ignores them. The SEYA central framework is a little bit more explicit than the SNA is with regard to renewable energy assets. But it argues that the value of renewable energy assets is likely to be found in the value of the land associated with the renewable energy assets. So, for example, that the value of solar power would be captured in the value of the land on which solar panels are installed, or that the value of wind power would be captured in the value of the land on which wind assets are installed. We feel that there are a number of problems with that approach, and that is not, in fact, conceptually the right way to think about the value of renewable energy assets. So there are several problems with it. And next slide, please. So one of the problems is simply that not all renewable energy assets are associated with land. An awful lot of new installations of wind power, for example, is happening offshore. And clearly offshore areas have no value in the national accounts. There is no measured value. They have no economic use other than potentially their use for wind power. So it's hard to argue that the value of offshore wind assets could be associated with the value of the land underneath the turbines, because that land, or in fact that water, has no value. But even in the case of renewable energy assets that are installed on land, it's often the case that they are installed on land that has no other economic value. So, for example, land in remote or desert areas that might be used for solar or wind farms would have a zero value on the national balance sheet right now. So again, arguing that the value of the renewable energy assets is somehow captured in the value of that land seems problematic. In the case of geothermal assets, for example, again, it's problematic. Even in the instance of privately owned geothermal assets, or privately owned land, I should say, the value of subsoil assets is often separated from the value of the surface land. So again, it's difficult to argue that there would be any correlation between the value of the surface of the land and the value of any geothermal assets that might exist under the land when those two ownership rights are clearly separate. And then the final concern that we have with the current SEYA argument that renewable energy assets are associated with the value of land is simply that approach is inconsistent with the approach that the SEYA takes to the valuation of other natural assets. So, for example, in the case of standing timber, the SEYA clearly recognizes that there is a value of timber that is separate from the value of the land on which the timber is grown. So, for the sake of consistency, one would think that we should treat renewable energy assets in the same fashion. Next slide, please. So our view is that renewable energy assets have evolved to the point now where they meet both the SNA and the SEYA asset definition. Ownership rights can be and are enforced, and there is clear generation of economic benefits. The SEYA already recognizes, and the SNA already recognizes a variety of natural assets, including land, mineral and energy resources, natural biological resources, surface and groundwater, and importantly, the electromagnetic spectrum, as Emmanuel was saying in the previous presentation. Next slide, please. So we would argue that the treatment of the radio spectrum in the SNA serves potentially as a model for the treatment of renewable energy assets. The spectrum, the inclusion of the spectrum as an asset in the SNA is relatively recent. And it coincided with the rise of the cellular telephone telecommunications industry. And it really arose because national accountants realized that governments were raising billions of dollars of revenue from the auction of the radio spectrum. So they were essentially exercising an ownership right over the spectrum, exercising that right in order to not just simply to raise government revenue, but also to control access to the spectrum, so that users' use of it could be controlled, and that high quality services could be provided to cellular telephone users. And we would argue that the same features can apply to renewable energy assets as well. They generate economic benefits and can be brought under control of governments through regulations and laws. Next slide, please. So we would argue that a new asset should be added to the existing classifications of natural resource assets in both the SNA and in the SEYA. So here we see the current lists of natural resource assets that are recognized in the SNA and the SEYA. And we would simply recommend adding a new asset called renewable energy resources to each of the classifications of natural resource assets. Next slide, please. Now, of course, if you're going to add the asset to the balance sheet, then there needs to be a methodology devised for valuing the asset. And there are several approaches that have been explored in the literature to the valuation of renewable energy assets. One that has been attempted by a number of academic researchers is an approach that is called the least cost alternative. And this is an approach by which the rent attributable to renewable energy assets is estimated by comparing renewable energy generation against the next least cost alternative source of energy. Conceptually, it's a very attractive approach, but technically it's complex to implement and may in fact be too complex for the purposes of national accounting, because it involves some relatively elaborate modeling of energy systems that would likely make it impractical. So although it's conceptually attractive, it's practically not very much so. So the other approach that could be applied is the standard residual value approach that has been applied now for quite some time in the context of the SEYA for the valuation of other natural assets such as timber and minerals and fossil fuels. So essentially, the residual value approach says that in long-term stable natural resource markets, there will arise a natural resource rent that can be estimated as the difference between the revenues generated from the natural resource extraction activity and the costs associated with that activity, including the normal returns to the produced capital assets that are used in the activity. And that approach, as I said, has been widely applied in the case of timber, minerals, and fossil fuels. It works quite well, generally speaking. We do find that rent arises and that rent can be estimated using the residual value approach. And we don't see any particular conceptual reason why the approach ought not to be applied to the valuation of renewable energy assets as well. There are some challenges, however, that need to be considered. And in particular, the main conceptual challenge is that the argument for the estimation of rent via the residual value approach rests upon the notion that markets for renewable energy are in something close to long-term equilibrium. But the fact is that markets around the world typically aren't in long-term equilibrium for natural resource or for renewable energy assets, at least not yet. And this is mainly because those markets remain heavily subsidized by governments in order to encourage entry into the market. And there's also considerable.
Rob, I just want to let you know you have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just about done, and I'll pass it over to Grzegorz. There's some considerable uncertainty in the markets as well. So we can't assume that there is equilibrium in these markets. Nonetheless, we think that the markets are moving in that direction and that therefore the use of the residual value approach makes sense. So next slide, please. So Grzegorz is now going to talk about the results of some pilot estimates, some pilot work that we've done estimating values for 15 countries, and then some more elaborate results for a smaller group of countries. So I'll hand it over to Grzegorz at this point. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So indeed, having this methodology developed by Rob, we brought a colleague from who was an expert from IRENA, the International Agency for Renewable Energy, and we've decided to stress test this methodology on trying to estimate the value of renewable energy assets for hydropower, for wind and solar, for 15 countries. And as you can see, we have found that the value of hydropower, which can be considered safely a mature technology operating in mature electricity markets, have been quite significant and quite high, albeit quite volatile, on which I'll say a little bit further. But also predictably, the value of solar and wind energy, using the residual value approach, was essentially zero until now, and it's predictable for the technologies and assets that are nascent, that are in the early stage of development, and markets which are still quite heavily supported by the governments. What is interesting is that when we calculated the wealth or the asset value per unit of electricity produced, you can see that both for wind and solar, they are asymptotically approaching zero or a flexing point. And perhaps in many countries, they have already become positive, although our accounts end up at 2017. So we haven't seen, except for wind power in a few countries, we haven't seen positive asset values before 2017. If you go to the next slide, what is interesting is that we were stress testing these results by checking whether the volatility of, for instance, hydropower asset value can be explained by the market events, by any external events that would make the wealth accounts a sensible representation of what's happening in the ground on the market. And we found that indeed these estimates of the asset value of hydropower really follow very closely the major impacts such as changes in the sudden shifts in exchange rates. For instance, the two spikes in the hydropower asset value, one in 1993 has been caused by the denomination of the Russian ruble, and you can see that there is all of a sudden appreciation of the hydropower asset value in 1993 after the monetary policy reform in Russia, and another big spike was in 2014-15, which was a joint impact on the El Nino event and the drought in Brazil, as well as the World Cup in Brazil, which really boosted the electricity prices in Brazil for a couple of years. So many stress testing show that it is a good representation of the real market trends that we expect would influence the market value, which is prices, exchange rates, and costs. Next slide. Which shows, it's the last slide, which shows that we've also stress tested the value of especially solar and wind power as assets, and how this value could be influenced by policies. As Rob said, currently the electricity markets on which solar and wind operate are often distorted. And we found out that the zero negative asset values are often caused not just by the renewable subsidies, but also by the way that thermal power is treated on the electricity market. So, for instance, we have brought our energy group of the World Bank, and Javier Inon did simulations with the long-term power sector planning model. For instance, how would the solar and wind energy value in Angola and South Africa, Angola being rich in oil and gas, South Africa being rich in coal, how would this energy asset value change for solar and wind if, for instance, the early retirement of the existing thermal power plants were allowed on this market? And what if the carbon pricing was introduced to cover the external costs produced and generated by the thermal power plants? So we found out that indeed in both Angola and South Africa, policy reforms, both in terms of design of electricity market as well as carbon pricing, climate policies, can have a significant impact, positive impact, boosting renewable energy asset value in these countries within the decade or so to the levels that is comparable to their fossil fuel wealth. So that's why I think going forward, it is so important that we do account this missing value of renewable energy in the government balance sheets and in the international classification of assets. And that's why in the Changing World of Nations, in the World Bank, we are committed to extend and introduce the renewable energy assets into the core accounts going forward and calculate it for all 150 countries that we have in mind. And it would be so much helpful if the NSA and SEYA community have considered adding renewable energy into their asset classifications. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, both Rob and Gregorz. I gave you a little grace period there. Conclude your presentation, but it's extremely fascinating and well presented. I really appreciate it. And since joining the World Bank about a year ago, almost now, I've had the privilege of becoming a bit more familiar with all the work in the Changing Wealth of Nations and how it kind of really brings forward the yardstick in terms of natural capital measurement of other forms of capital as well. And I think national accounting has things to learn from appreciate you presenting here. So not to get too far behind schedule, I'd like to pass it over right away to the third presentation, and this will be from Roel Delahaye. Please correct me if I've mispronounced your name, on policy applications using both the SNA and SEYA in the Netherlands. So Roel, please, you have 15 minutes approximately.
Thank you very much, Catherine. You pronounced it very, very good. I'll try to share my screen. No, I don't think this works, right? You don't. Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
It seems
Catherine?
to be coming up, Roel. Yes, I can hear you.
Does it?
Yes, but it seems to be coming up.
You shared full screen. Just please close and try to open share screen again and choose window. And
okay.
so
I close it now. I try
click
it again.
again. Click again.
The window.
Choose window. Choose PowerPoint window. It's just little bit small windows.
Yeah,
Click on it and click on share button.
The problem is I don't see my PowerPoint, so I don't know what's going on. Maybe I can opt for the same
if you want, I can
option as Rob.
share the presentation. It might be easier.
Yeah, so Marlon, if you don't mind, maybe sharing again. You seem to be having a little trouble in this session.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine, for giving me the opportunity to say something about how we in the Netherlands use the SEYA in combination with the national accounts to derive indicators that are being used by our policymakers with regard to sustainability and well-being. Next slide, please. I want to very briefly say something about SEYA and the benefits for the people who might not be familiar, and then go into three policy areas that are very current or very hip and happening in the Netherlands. These are with regard to circular economy, footprints, and the carbon accounts. Next slide, please. So SEYA, the System of Environmental and Economic Accounting, is a satellite account with national accounts. And the SEYA modules extend the national accounts in three different ways, I would say. First of all, we specify monetary environmental information from the national accounts. And then we can say something for example, for environmental subsidies, taxes, or the environmental sector. Another dimension is that we add a physical dimension to the monetary data. We do this, for example, for the energy accounts, material flow accounts, and water accounts. So instead of having monetary figures on the production of energy carriers, we also have these data in joules. And finally, the third dimension is that we add physical non-monetary data. This can be data with regard to assets or waste or emissions to the environment or the natural capital with ecosystem services. The benefits, which I hope I'll show you with the examples, is that the total of these different modules is more than the sum of its parts. So combining these different modules and the national accounts gives more information than the individual parts would do, and that gives very relevant economic and environmental analysis. And that's what I hope to show you now. Please, next slide. So the first is circular economy. Next slide, please. Policy questions regarding circular economies are on different levels. In the Netherlands, we have a circular economy program, and therefore our policymakers set a target that in 2030, 50% of the abiotic resources, there should be a reduction of 50% in 2030. Of course, there's also the European Action Plan for Circular Economy, and now the Green Deal, who mentioned circular economy. And then, of course, there are also the SDGs, which I mentioned 2 here, but I think circular economy affects many more SDGs. So on all kind of levels, there's requests for information on the circular economy. Now I go back to the Dutch policymakers and the Dutch targets. Next slide, please. So this is a Sankey diagram of the material flows that we have made for the Netherlands. From left to right, you see the materials that enter our economy by imports or domestic extraction. Then they're being processed, and after processing, they're being used. They go to exports or energy consumption or our domestic final consumption. And with regard to our domestic final consumption, these products, well, they have an end of life, and then they become waste. And then you can see that, well, in the case of the Netherlands, about 80% of the waste goes back into the economy. So if you look here at our target of the Dutch government is to reduce abiotic materials, and you look at the processed materials arrow, then you can see there are 3 ways that the government can achieve this. So either they can substitute abiotic materials for biotic materials, they can increase the amount of secondary materials being used, or they can make production processes more efficient. Now, these are 3 drivers of this to get this target, and this can only be seen in this complete picture because we combined different modules of the SEYA with also the national accounts. So the material flows are used for the imports, exports, and domestic extraction. We use our waste accounts, we use our energy accounts, we use our air emission accounts, but also we use our national accounts, and we use the supply and use tables of the national accounts, and we have converted them to fiscal units. So in this picture, you see processed material is just a black box, but actually we have information about all kinds of products and all kinds of sectors that supply and use materials. So I think this is a good example on how the SEYA and SNA can be combined and provide very useful information. Next slide, please. So Eurostat also, well, the European Commission also has a monitoring framework, which is being monitored by Eurostat. They also compile a similar Sankey. And recently the Commission considered a new dimension to this monitoring framework, which is called Global Sustainability and Resilience. And this new dimension states that the contribution of circularity to climate neutrality and zero pollution, and also to be accountable for spillovers of European consumption. So to look at production outside the European Union, induced by final demand. And these 2 aspects, they can be captured, I think, by the carbon accounts and by footprint analysis. And these 2 are also a result of SEYA in combination with the national accounts. And therefore, I would like to talk first a little about the footprints. Next slide, please. So the Dutch politicians most of the policy is targeted to domestic emissions, for example, but they realize more and more that also the emissions in the production chain are important. So they also are requesting these figures, and we see this in different policy areas. So we see it in the circular economy program, we see it in our program on climate and energy outlook, but we also see it in well-being indicators. And they have demand on footprints for resources, greenhouse gas emissions, water, land, and biodiversity. So all kind of different footprints they demand. And of course, in order to estimate footprints, the input-output tables of the national accounts are very valuable and is what you need then. If you combine these input-output tables with the SEYA data on the material flow accounts, for example, or greenhouse gas emissions or water, you can estimate footprints. And what we have done in Holland, we used multi-regional input-output tables, but we have developed a methodology to implement our own input-output table, so the one that Statistics Netherlands compiles into this multi-regional input-output table, and then adjust the rest of the world. There are also challenges with this methodology. There are different ways to estimate these footprints. There are also different data sources available, and unfortunately, the results of using these different data and methodologies, they give different figures, and this is something our Dutch policy makers are not too happy with. So what we need is a harmonized, consistent, up-to-date, detailed multi-regional input-output table, and I hope this will be something that will be developed in the future. I think the Figaro project is a good example of this. Another challenge we have is with regard to circular economy, is to estimate how much circular economy actually contributes to the reduction of the environmental impact. So this is also something we are currently looking at now. Next slide, please. This is an example of our Dutch footprint. You see a slight decrease between 2008 and 2017. The footprint consists here of two parts. So the first are the emissions by Dutch economy. And then we have what we call the emission surplus. So this is the emissions related to the imported product minus the emissions related to the exported product. And you can see for the Netherlands, this is relatively small. And this is mainly because we use quite a lot of energy to produce products that are being exported. So we have quite a big chemical sector, and also our cattle breeding is very big, and we export a lot of meat and chemical products. Next slide, please. So this is the final thing I would like to address, is the carbon accounts. This is something that is still in development. I think it would be of good use for our policymakers, but we're still trying to make them aware of it. It would be good to address the low carbon economy, and in the carbon accounts, which is part of the ecosystem accounts of SEYA, combines 3 SEYA modules. The carbon flows and stocks within the economy. So this is again the material flow account and the circular economy I discussed before. You have carbon emissions from the economy, the emission accounts, and you have carbon sequestration and emissions from nature. And this is part of the natural capital ecosystem services module. And by combining these carbon accounts, policymakers can see where is the largest leakage of emissions to our atmosphere, but also where is the largest potential of storage. And I think these will be very valuable. We also work on a monetary valuation of these ecosystem services. We'll give a more direct link to the national accounts. Next slide, please. Yes, as I said before, we're still working on the carbon accounts. One of our challenges is to make it presentable and accessible for policymakers. So now we only have this table. The only thing I want to show here is that in the columns you can see the different types of carbon, so geocarbon, biocarbon, carbon in the economy, and carbon in the atmosphere. And in the rows, you can see how much is being added to the stocks and how much being deducted by the stocks. And then my last slide. I hope I give you an impression about how the multiple SEYA modules and the national accounts provide unique opportunities to support policymakers. I also would like to post a message here that the communication between SEYA people and national accounts people is very important to keep the alignment between these two parts and therefore assure future environmental economy policy applications. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roel, and you've managed to regain a couple of minutes from to put us a little bit back on track. So this is really interesting work by the Netherlands that really demonstrates how the integration of information from SNA and SEYA can really respond to a lot of really important policy topics of the day, as you say. So that integrating and harmonizing these it really has implications for that. And of course, that's the effort that we're trying to do within this SNA revision, is sort of bring on board some of these SEYA concepts more into the mainstream system of national accounts to the extent that it's possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, this time, my moderator is Jorrit, who's coming back in. And I think, Jorrit, you've been monitoring the chat, and perhaps you can start to summarize some of the findings there. I see that there's already a conversation happening between some of the presenters responding. So maybe we can bring that into the light of the broader forum. So you want to try and summarize a bit, please?
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think you're absolutely right that there is already a discussion starting. So let me start with the first couple of questions, and then I will further monitor the chat if new questions come in. So for now, it's questions related to the first two presentations. So for Emmanuel, there is a question from Portugal. So they strongly support the work and the need for testing, also bearing in mind data sources and what is feasible. Specific question regarding the resource rent and how to value this in the accounts. So how would it show up in the government accounts, and what would be the time of recording? Sanjeev is raising a similar question. He makes a plea that we should avoid the resource rent ending up in the production accounts via gross operating surplus. So it's mainly a question of how are we going to account for this resource rent. And he's also raising the question, indeed, if we should look upon these permits as a right to use or as a right to pollute. So just to hear your views on that. And then finally, Peter, he's very much in favor of the second option. So Peter van der Ven, indeed, to regard it as a right to use. He thinks that's the most logical and most elegant way, and he also fails to see some issues that are being raised by some people criticizing this approach to consider the atmosphere as an asset, and he feels that it's not really different from permits to catch fish in open seas, in oceans. No one is owning the oceans, so there might be a parallel with the emission permits. So those are the first set of questions for Emmanuel, and then for the presentation by the colleagues from the World Bank. Again, some questions from Peter. Excellent presentation, and he very much agrees with the main proposals. He was wondering indeed about the use of market prices, so he would not immediately exclude that from the table. It might be relevant, for example, to look at the value of land with and without permits to build, for example, wind turbines. So that might be providing some useful information. Then Sanjeev, he agrees indeed that the link with land is very weak, so he very much supports other approaches, and he wonders indeed whether they also will allow for conditions and how these may affect some of the effectiveness of the renewables. So there was already some back and forth in responding going on. So maybe Gregor and Rob might elaborate a bit on that. And Joe St. Lawrence indeed also asked about this specific accounting for these flows and how these may turn into stock estimates. So are you going to have specific assumptions about what we see in the present and in the past, and just assume similar returns for the future? So I think that's the first set of questions, and I think there are a couple more coming in also for Roel. So I will have a look at those while the while the presenters are answering these first questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jorrit. That's a great summary. So maybe we'll just go in the order that we presented. So maybe we'll start with Emmanuel, and I don't know, perhaps Jim would like to come in too. If he wants to come in, maybe he can just indicate in the chat. So Emmanuel, if you'd like to respond to the points that have already been raised by Jorrit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. So I'll take, I guess, the second question first, and then I'll go back to the first. So what we're seeing here is that, you know, the atmosphere is not owned by any institutional unit, and what they do, the permit is giving the right to use, you know, some of the services that are being provided by the atmosphere. So the asset is distinct, you know, from the resource itself. However, the value, you know, the resource and the asset, the value is linked between the natural resource and the asset. So that's what, so we're just saying it is the right to use, because what we're seeing is the government, what it's trying to do is it's trying to change or alter the production processes, you know, of CO2 emitting firms to try to adapt, you know, cleaner technologies while continuing to produce their goods and services. Now, in terms of the resource rent calculation, what that approach was trying to elaborate is that we need to bridge, you know, the difference between the issue price and the market price. So the forward only takes a value at the time of surrender, and then what we will do is that we need to create, you know, a new, you know, financial asset or a liability, depending on whether the market price increases compared to the issue price, and that would mean then the acquirer has a financial asset, or if the price decreases, or, you know, so it's a lot lower than the issue price, then the issuer, the government in this case, will benefit. They will have the asset. So what we're trying to do with that approach is that at the time of surrender, we need to look at the market price, and then that will be determining what's going to impact, you know, the net lending borrowing. But to bridge the gap between the issue price and the market price, we need to create a financial asset or liability. Now, in the paper, we have we show two examples. You know, when the market price increases and when the market price decreases. So you can take a look at those. They're very relatively simple, but please take a look, and if further elaboration is required, then please let us know, and we'll respond accordingly. That's it for the moment.
Great, thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say,
ahead.
I apologize, Catherine. I'm not sure whether Jim wants to jump in.
Yeah, I just checked in with Jim. He don't need to come in on my part. He just wanted to highlight that we plan to continue and consult on this work, specifically through the, I think through the global consultation, if that's straight. And with the SEYA communities, of course, and the other statistical standards, GFS and SEYA.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to then pass it over to Rob and Gregor to respond to the points that were already raised that you had already brought forward. So I don't know who would like to start. Rob, maybe?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah. So thanks to everyone for the comments. Look, you know, the issue of valuation of renewable energy assets is clearly not fully worked out at this point. And what we've put forward in the paper is a proposal that we think is interesting and has some value, but you know, is certainly not necessarily the last word on it. You know, the question of whether or not there can be a stock of the renewable energy asset conceptualized or not I'm not sure to what extent that's a really serious concern, because there are lots of assets that we value on the balance sheet where it's not possible to conceptualize very easily of a stock of the assets. Intellectual property, for example, where it's not clear what the stock of intellectual property is, but yet we put a value on those assets nonetheless. Peter raised a point about the valuation of solar power produced by households. I would say that implicitly the approach that we recommend, which is the valuation of renewable energy via the residual rent calculation, would include the valuation of solar power produced by households. So it should be captured. But I think one of the things that we need to work out if we were to go forward with this methodology is how to avoid double counting, because I think Peter has made the point, and I think I've heard Joe St. Lawrence make the point elsewhere as well, that there is likely to be some value of renewable energy captured in some land asset values. So if we're going to go forward with the residual valuation methodology, then we need to come up with a methodology to eliminate the possibility of double counting. And we actually deal with that issue a little bit in the technical paper that we've written on this topic. So if you're interested in our thoughts on that, you can find them in there. But I'll leave it at that, and then hand it over to Grzegorz if he has points that he wants to add.
Grzegorz?
Yeah, just that reply to the question, I think by Sanjeev, to what extent the variability of the flows related flows of water or wind, or especially water and wind, would be reflected in the value of assets. And actually, that's why we've done this stress testing with 15 countries, and we did find that a lot of weather, we can say climate-induced events, such as droughts in Brazil, Turkey, and Spain, have pushed the asset value of hydropower, to zero for a year or two. The same goes with the variability of wind, or with the quality of wind at the different sites. We can see that it is very well reflected in the value of assets through the impact of production costs, through the impact of the revenues available. So far, I think it's a good a realistic matrix that also really reflects the predictable impacts of different external events on asset values. And just one more comment on the land. When we do it in the changing world of nations, we, for the sake of comparability across many countries, we make a lot of simplifying assumptions. But if the national accountants are calculating the value of renewable energy, the cost of the land will reduce the rents that arises from renewable energy itself. If you have to put a solar plant on the valuable agricultural land, the cost of lease of this land will reduce the rent that accrues to renewable energy. So I think in practical terms, there are ways to avoid double counting. But when you do the asset valuation for 150 countries, we may indeed lose some of it. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure whether there were particular questions directed at Roel, but perhaps we'll give him a chance to weigh in.
Well, there is a specific question for Roel from Japan. This is mainly related to what is included in the at Statistics Netherlands. So he assumes that for the moment it's mainly focusing on carbon sequestration, and he's wondering indeed if there are any plans to expand to other ecosystem services. So maybe Roel can have a go at that.
Roel, would you like to come in? I don't know if he has to be brought back in.
Yes, you can hear me now,
There
I
we
hope.
go.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Yes, this was just an example of the ecosystems and the carbon accounts, but we do a lot of work on the other ecosystems as well. I think there's a report due very soon. Yeah, this is quite developed, and we also do this in commission of our government.
Okay, I think we might have a few other questions that have accumulated, or have we addressed many of them?
I think we have addressed many of them. So there was some support indeed from Rob Smith for the second option as presented by Emmanuel. So I think this will indeed be part of the testing and tasting the water to see the preferences of various people on the three options. And then indeed the discussion on energy produced by households via solar panels. I know Peter is quite keen on that. As he now has some solar panels himself, so he's producing like crazy. And I think indeed, as was already alluded to by the colleagues from the World Bank, this is already accounted for, but I think for the national accounts, it will be specific issue indeed. How do we distinguish between what is provided back to the grid and what is used for own account consumption? And then this may relate to unpaid household activities, probably. So curious indeed if there are some thoughts on how to break it down. Sanjeev was already providing some insights on a possible way to do so. And John Verender mentioned indeed that this is an important topic that we should try to address coming up with more guidance in the near future. That's it.
Okay, maybe I'll give folks one last chance. We can take a little bit more time if there are any final questions that anyone would like to raise in the chat, or you could just raise your green hand, I believe, if you'd like to take the floor before I conclude, and then I'll try and give a little bit of summary of the session, and then a few concluding remarks. Anyone else that would like to take the floor or raise anything else in the chat? No, not yet. Going, gone. Okay.
Catherine,
Rob,
it's
would you like to
Rob.
come back? Sure,
Yeah,
come on in.
if I could, yeah, thanks, yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to address this point of whether or not we can consider the atmosphere an asset or not, and I think it's worth making the point that amongst the group of researchers that look at the question of natural capital outside of the context of national accounting, it is commonly accepted that the atmosphere is an asset, and that our use of the atmosphere as a sink for pollutants is in fact the use of what is called in the natural capital community use of an ecological service. And so I think it is uncontroversial in that community, that is to say the people who focus on natural capital who aren't national accountants, that the asset should be considered, or the atmosphere should be considered an asset. So I think it would be entirely in keeping with the best thinking that is going on outside of the national accounting community if the national accounting community were to simply say, look, the atmosphere is in fact an asset. It ought to be reflected in the SNA as such, and therefore we ought to begin to think about the concepts and methods that are required within the SNA to accept the fact that the atmosphere is in fact an asset. So doing that would simply be aligning the SNA community with where the broader natural capital community has been on this topic for I think many years now. So that I would strongly encourage that we move in that direction. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Rob. That's a very, I think that's a very strong argument. I think that the conversation needs not only to happen in the national accounts community, but also in the SEYA community. And I believe the idea for SEYA is to embark on a next revision of the SEYA Central Framework as a next step, now that the experimental ecosystem accounts have been not called experimental anymore, ecosystem accounts have been released. So I think we really, again, that sort of emphasizes the need for coordination between those two communities in these conversations to make sure that everyone is harmonizing in the same direction. So maybe, Rob, since you've come in, maybe I should give each of the presenters another chance if they'd like to take the floor to respond to any of the final points that have been raised. So maybe I'll start again with Emmanuel. Anything else you'd like to bring in? If not, that's fine. Just wanted to give you the opportunity.
No, the only thing, just a comment, is that Jim and I have updated the paper, not to totally take a stance on one proposal over another. And what we would like to do is we would like to, send the paper to global consultation and get the views of countries. But perhaps there could be an alternative that we haven't thought of. But at the same time, we really need the feedback from countries to make sure that we can move forward with one of the recommendations. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Emmanuel. Anything else you'd like to add, Roel?
Thank you very much, Catherine.
And come back to Gregorz. Gregorz, anything else?
Just a question that I expressed in the chat box, which is it would be very useful to understand the interest and the timeline of when can we expect some guidelines from the SEYA and SNA community on the classification of renewable energy as economic asset.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is that we'd really like your input on that, Gregorz, because we would like to consider that within the task team of environmental economic accounts. So we'd like to consider renewable energy, but we still need to have that full discussion. And Do St. Lawrence is now leading that task team. But for sure, we would like to have some input to understand what's achievable. Have I missed anything, Jorrit?
I don't think so. I only see a couple of additional comments indeed now coming in on the household production of electricity, a service or a good. It seems to be a good. So this is to be accounted for in the core framework. So definitely a need for further guidance. Yeah.
Everyone seems to be aligned on that point. And by the way, Rob and Gregorz, if you got the endorsement from Peter Van de Ven, I think that's a really strong endorsement. So that should give you a great deal of encouragement. So what I'll do now is we do have enough time left. So I'm going to just maybe try and give a very brief summary, and then I'll have some things to say for next steps. But first, I want to really thank all of the three sets of presenters for these really excellent presentations, which I think, even though they appear to be very diverse, there's a lot of commonality between them in terms of really questioning the status quo and bringing us forward and thinking about where we need to go to address these important issues around environmental economic accounts within the context of the system of national accounts, or the kind of mainstream SNA. So first, we had a very meaty presentation, which was very succinctly and clearly presented by Emmanuel Manolakakis, where the IMF is exploring alternatives for treatments on carbon pricing schemes, in particular emissions permits, and SNA guidance for environmental economic accounting. And really, this presentation and the guidance, the proposed guidance that outlines options, it really highlights the difficulties with the implementation of the current SNA treatment, which is, has a number of problems that were perhaps first not envisaged previously around the split asset approach. And it also identifies the impacts of two alternative treatments, one as a license or permit, a right to use asset, and the second as a resource lease. Both these latter treatments have to recognize the atmosphere as an asset, and we've just had a bit of a conversation about how that's a little bit unavoidable in terms of the views of this group here. So recognizing the atmosphere as an asset within the SNA, but this also, of course, has implications for both the SNA and for the system of environmental economic accounts. The second paper, the second presentation by Rob and Gregorz, presents World Bank work to account for renewable energy within the context of the Changing Wealth of Nations comprehensive wealth measures at the World Bank. and proposes that renewable energy assets be separated from land values and deviating from the current SNA treatment and SEYA treatment, and shown separately as in the asset classifications of both those systems of accounts. And it also recommends a residual value method applied to approximate exchange value, and it's been highlighted here in the group that we also need to think about household production of energy within that context. The third presentation by Raoul and his colleagues from Statistics Netherlands shows how the information from SEYA and the SNA frameworks can be combined to inform policy in three important areas, and those areas are very topical these days: circular economy, footprints, and carbon accounts. And it emphasizes the importance of the partnership across these communities, which we've heard several times throughout this morning's session, and also it has implications for integrating and aligning these concepts, which is really the way that we're trying to go in the SNA revisions, is to really explore to what extent some of the SEYA concepts can be brought on board. But again, some of the recommendations that we're exploring have implications for both the SNA and the SEYA systems. So all really great, a very rich discussion this morning, and I want to thank the presenters and also all of the participants who raised questions. You can see that this is a very, very interesting discussion. Also like to thank Jorrit for his excellent moderation skills this morning for this second session on environmental economic accounting, which I was very pleased to conclude the 2 days of topics on well-being and sustainability within the system of national accounts. So I believe that, I guess the last I'd also like to thank the session organizers, Teomira and company, and thanks for all your great support, and also the interpreters for the work that they've done to try and make sure that this is understandable by everyone. I need to announce that we'll be circulating the main conclusions of this report after the last session in this set of webinars for the group of experts in national accounts. The last meeting actually concludes next Wednesday, May the 26th. So there will be an evaluation questionnaire that will be circulated at that time, and we really appreciate your feedback. Also, one session of the seminars will be and will take place Tuesday, that's next Tuesday, May 25th, starting at 1 o'clock Central European time, so Geneva time, and the link will be open 1 hour before the meeting. And I guess the one last thing that I want to emphasize is that throughout the sessions in the last 2 days, we've talked about how many of the guidance notes that we're preparing under the task team for wellbeing and sustainability are going to be circulated for public consultation very soon. So we would appreciate if you keep your eyes open for these and provide whatever feedback you can. And as Emmanuel stated, there are going to be options for the emissions permits, and we'd really like to understand the perspective of all of you on those options, and to have your feedback on the viability and the feasibility of all of the proposed guidance under the wellbeing and sustainability SNA revision effort. So have I missed anything? Teomira, is there anything? I think you said you didn't need to come back in, but perhaps if I've missed anything you'd like to. Teomira or Rami? Teomira's coming in, okay.
So I don't know if Jorrit wants to come back, but from us, no. Thank you very much, Catherine. What you missed is thank you for very well organized session by you and Jorrit. A lot of really interesting presentations and interesting discussion. And see the others on Tuesday with the globalization session.
Anything else from your perspective, Jorrit?
I think we're fine. So thank you very much, and wishing everyone a very nice weekend.
All right. And have a great weekend, and thanks again for your active participation in these 2 days. Thanks.